FIDE Grand Prix series is coming to a conclusion. Today was round 9 in Khanty-Mansiysk, and if you recall, there are just 3 players who have a chance to get those 2 spots through to the candidates tournament of 2016. Fabiano Caruana and Hikaru Nakamura, who lead the tournament, but Yevgeny Tomashevsky, who lags behind but has done very well in previous Grand Prix tournaments. So Caruana and Nakamura both played solid games today. They both drew, so could Tomashevsky win and keep the pressure on those 2 players? Tomashevsky was black against Peter Svidler today. We joined the game after 15 moves. It's a typical anti-martial kind of position where white has this solid pawn chain, nice Spanish bishop on a2, and Svidler has managed to establish this knight on f5. Now, normally in the Spanish that's very strong, but black has a solid position. Tomashevsky has great experience with this particular line. In fact, he played it earlier in the tournament against Anish Giri. He lost that game, but probably had a decent position. And yeah, here he's probably doing okay. He's taken a pawn here, so black is a pawn up. Now, it's not the best pawn in the world, but even so, that could be annoying if black were to get some pressure down the b file. Svidler could play modestly here. He could play, for example, bishop d2 and look to try and regain that pawn on a4. And I think, but black should be okay here as well. It's probably about equal. It's also possible to play queen f3, also not a bad move. But instead he lashed out with f4, so it almost looks a bit like a king's gambit in some ways. But of course, when you play a move like f4, moving up a pawn in front of your king, it raises the stakes in a game. You might be able to get a nice attack down the f-file, but white's king is somewhat weakened along this diagonal and also along the second rank. If the initiative swings in black's favour, white could pay. So it's a double-edged move. Of course, Svidler understands this. Let's see what happened in the game. Knight e6. So this is obviously good. That knight on a5 is misplaced. It comes back into the game wanting to go into d4. So c3 was played to stop that. Rook b8, excellent move. So it means it's not so easy for Svidler to bring this bishop on c1 into play because of the pressure here. Rook f1, okay, logical if you've played f4. And black took on f4. Now, well, bishop takes f4, I think is the move we'd like to play, but remember there's pressure on b2, so rook takes f4, but I don't know, already this looks a bit ugly. Knight e5 is a good move. That is a sensitive spot in white's position. So the knight keeps an eye on that, and you never know, a move like knight g6 may be reasonable at some moment. The knight on e5 looks good anyway. Svidler exchanged off knight for bishop, and now bagged the next bishop. That knight can't be lived with, has to be exchanged off. But now, well, you can see that actually white's development is rather poor, actually. If these pieces were somehow already over on the king's side, there would be good chances to develop some kind of pressure on black's king side, but here it's a very different situation. c4 is an excellent move by Tomashevsky. Now, I think white is probably still okay if he plays d4 and something like this. I mean, yeah, maybe queen f3 here. It's not so bad. Of course, the rook is nicely placed on b2, but, you know, white is completing his development and probably can balance things there. Instead, Svidler played bishop takes c4, and this starts to look a bit dubious. d4. Yeah, if the king goes in the corner, then you can see that this bishop could be taken, and then knight takes e4, and there are problems here on f2. So d4. And now perhaps Svidler was pinning his hopes on this move, queen f1. So if this knight is protected or it moves, then rook takes f6. But an excellent move here by Tomaszewski. For example, well, it's possible to play knight takes e4 to stop the threat of rook f6, but then queen takes knight, and that's probably okay for white. But Tomaszewski improved that variation by flicking in a3 first. Now that's a very nice use of this extra pawn, actually. So this was taken. Svidler doesn't have a choice there. And the point is to undermine the support for the pawn on c3. So now he goes in for this variation. And in this case, he can take that pawn on c3. And you can see that black is now a clear pawn up. And actually positionally he stands very well, because really white needs a pawn on f2 to support the bishop and also to protect the second rank. And we're going to see now that Svidler's king is in big trouble. So there's pressure on this pawn, but very sensibly Tomaszewski just ditches that. It's simply not important. The important things are control here along the e file and entering into white's position along the second rank. So let's see how he did this. Queen b2. It's not a lot of fun. And just take a look at the difference between the two king positions. Black's king behind 3 pawns and absolutely rock solid, but white's king is about to suffer. And positionally, this is dreadful. I mean, this is a nice move that just emphasizes black's positional advantage, actually. Rock solid, just making sure that that pawn is fixed on d4, and that means this bishop is absolutely rotten on e3, and what a beautiful knight that is on e4. And now black finds time to come in along the second rank. And Tomaszewski's play here is very simple, actually. What he's doing with shifting the queen to a2, not only protecting that pawn, but actually just making room for rook number 2 to come across. Of course, first of all, he makes sure his king has an escape square with h6. And now, really simple, the rook comes in on the second rank. He could play rook b2 here, but instead Tomaszewski just crashed through on g2 straight away, rook b2. You don't actually win the queen because Svidler blocks, but whatever he does here, he's completely lost. There's no defence to an attack along the second rank. He tried king g3, but after rook b3 check, he resigned. Well, going up the board is absolutely hopeless, and if the king comes back, then the best that white can do here is enter this absolutely hopeless endgame, where black has 3 connected pass pawns on the king's side, and basically white's pieces are no match for the queen when white's king is completely open. You know, it's impossible to hold the position together. It's completely winning. So Svidler chose to resign in that position. So Tomaszewski manages to close the gap on Caruana and Nakamura with 2 rounds to go. This is still an open contest, so who's going to get those final 2 places? Let me very quickly show you another game from round 9, and that was the end of the game between Yakovenko and Boris Gelfand. This was an extraordinary game, actually. Yakovenko played a really dynamic attack. They've reached this position. I know this is very, very complicated, but it's just the ending is very beautiful. Let me just give you a quick overview. Obviously, black is a piece up here, but white has 4 pawns for the piece, and well, the queen and bishop are very strong. Black is almost in Zugzwang in this position, actually. That pawn can't be taken because of queen g8 mate. If that knight moves, then, well, g6 will be on prise and the knight on d7. It's looking pretty desperate for Gelfand, but he found a fantastic defence. I mean, you could try a move like King G7, but once white exchanges queens, then that is hopelessly lost. I mean, there are various other tries, but don't work. But Gelfand found this amazing idea, G5. It's fantastically complicated. I mean, the first thing is if this knight is taken or the pawn is taken, then the queen comes down and delivers perpetual check. So obviously Yakovenko is playing for a win. He kept things closed with F5. And now King G7 actually should give black reasonable drawing chances here. This endgame, at first I thought this was just fantastic for white, but black seems to have reasonable drawing chances after knight F6, and then yeah, perhaps counter-attacking with the knight. Anyway, it's complicated, but reasonable drawing chances. Instead, Gelfand played knight D3, which is probably not as good, but he had seen a fantastic idea. It's an amazing concept. Well, first of all, the knight was taken. So now white is simply 4 pawns up. But here's Gelfand's idea. Queen A8 check. So the king has to move. And knight F4. So the counter-attack begins. And remarkably, white does not have a check here. That's rather important. So Queen G2, mate threatened. King F2. And now if the queen swoops down, well, there are lots of checks, but actually the king simply runs up the board here, and because everything is protected, it's no problem for white. The king finds safety at the other end of the board, and eventually the checks are going to run out and white will win. But look at Boris's idea, G4. This is remarkable. In fact, it still loses. If white plays King G3 here and just runs with the king, in fact, the checks run out. I mean, there are other variations, but that's kind of the basic idea. But I assume that Yakovenko hadn't seen Gelfand's idea. Maybe, who knows, maybe he was short of time. It's incredible. Black can now draw by force. Knight D5 check. Well, first of all, let's see what happens if this knight is taken. Of course, white wants to simplify here. But now, this will be a draw. King takes queen, and it's stalemate. And white can't avoid this. For example, King F3, we keep checking. King E4, and now the king has to take, and it's draw. So after knight D5, King D4 was played, but it's a draw. Queen F2. Black has to make some careful steps here. If white tries to avoid his fate, plays a move like King C4 or King E4, a knight fork will swing the game completely in the other direction. So, well, this knight had to be taken, and now, after this, again, it's the stalemate trick. If King E6, Queen F6, and, whoops, King takes as a draw, or King C6, Queen B6 will also be a draw. So after Queen D4 check, Yakovenko took, and that's a draw by stalemate. A fantastic save from Gelfand. So anyway, just to sum up again, 2 rounds to go. Dominguez, Caruana and Nakamura lead with 5.5. Tomashevsky lags behind on 4, but still 2 rounds to go. Anything could happen.